The 2021 African Cup of Nations will actually take place in 2022. It's a tournament which was supposed to be hosted by Ivory Coast, but will actually be hosted by Cameroon, who were supposed to host the 2019 African Cup of Nations, but were stripped of that right by the Confederation of African Football, or CAF, who awarded it to Egypt instead. Ivory Coast will now host the 2023 African Cup of Nations, meaning that scheduled 2023 host Guinea have been pushed back until the tournament in 2025. If that all seems a bit confusing, then that's probably because it is, though it is also pretty much par for the course in the ever-turbulent world of African football and its myriad of both past and present scandals, some of which we are going to explore in today's video. All being well, in about a week's time, the great and good of the African game will gather in Cameroon for a month-long festival of football. And whilst that is a phrase which is often used to describe international football tournaments, typically in a figurative sense, the African Cup of Nations really is often quite like a festival. Not everyone will be partying in the cities of Douala, Yaoundé and Limbe though, as the likes of Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane and Riyad Mahrez descend upon Cameroon for a tournament which has provoked more controversy than most amidst a backdrop of numerous scandals, COVID denialism and corruption that goes right to the very top of Cameroon's government, leading to questions over whether the Central African nation should be afforded the privilege of hosting the continent's biggest football tournament at all. Our story starts in 2014, when Cameroon were awarded the 2019 African Cup of Nations hosting rights by the Confederation of African Football, at the same time as Ivory Coast were awarded the 2021 tournament and Guinea the finals for 2023. Cameroon's successful bid, triumphing over Algeria in the bidding process, caused a little bit of controversy at the time, with some claiming their success could be attributed to the fact that then CAF president, Issa Hayatou, is Cameroonian. There was also some surprise over Guinea being announced as host for 2023, given the fact that the announcement came on the same day as CAF banned Guinea from hosting any international football matches, along with Liberia and Sierra Leone, due to the outbreak of the Ebola virus in those countries. The CAF president at the time, Issa Hayatou, served as the president of the Confederation of African Football for 29 years, which is an incredibly long time, as well as serving as the acting president of FIFA from October 2015 to February 2016, beginning with Sepp Blatter's ban due to investigations into FIFA corruption and ending with the current president, Gianni Infantino's successful election campaign. Hayatou had run to become FIFA president on a permanent basis himself in 2002, losing out to Blatter, and he never actually stepped down as CAF president, despite being into his 70s and having had 3 decades in the job, but rather he lost a re-election bid in March 2017 to a man named Ahmed Ahmad from Madagascar. In the early 2010s, Hayatou was accused of having accepted large amounts of money in the form of bribes, both to influence him over TV rights in the 1990s and later in relation to Qatar's successful bid to host the 2022 World Cup. He also caused quite a bit of controversy when he banned the Togolese national team from competing in the next 2 African Cup of Nations tournaments due to Togo having pulled out of the tournament in 2010, which seemed a little bit harsh given the fact that Togo had only withdrawn from the competition after their team bus was targeted in a terrorist attack which left 3 people dead and a further 9 injured. Whilst Issa Hayatou has never been convicted or found guilty on corruption charges, though he was banned by FIFA for a year and fined $100,000 for breaching duty of loyalty rules in 2021, his successor has been a man who is so corrupt that they named him twice. Ahmed Ahmad was handed a 5-year ban by FIFA a little over a year ago after he was found also to have breached his duty of loyalty rules, offered gifts and other benefits, mismanaged funds, and to have abused his position as the CAF president, a sentence which was later reduced to 2 years after Ahmad challenged FIFA's ruling through the International Court of Arbitration for Sport. It is noticeable that after having just one president, in the form of Issa Hayatou, for a period of 29 years, CAF have since changed presidents 4 times in less than 5 years. In case you were wondering, Constant Amari failed an integrity and eligibility check in January 2021 and was therefore barred from seeking re-election. Meanwhile, the incumbent, Patrice Motsepe, is a literal billionaire and one of the richest men in South Africa who made his money in the famously ethical industry of mining precious metals. Anyhow, the fact of the matter is that Cameroon were successful in their bid to host the 2019 African Cup of Nations, but they were subsequently stripped of that right to host the tournament in 2018. Not because they were found to be illegitimate winners of a rigged voting process or anything like that, but because the country's preparations to host the tournament were a complete joke. What absolutely wasn't a joke, but also contributed to CAF's fast action, was the increasingly bloody resistant movements that had broken out in the Anglophone parts of the country, but more on that a little later on. Primarily, Cameroon's problem was that all of the stadiums that they had promised to build or renovate, along with roads, rail networks, and other infrastructure projects, were all just massive building sites, often with very little actually having been built there. It all looked extremely incompetent, coming from a government that had invested a whopping 1.8 billion euros into the project, some 9 times more than France spent hosting Euro 2016. Accusations of negligence or incompetence might have been rather generous though, and allegations of a more sinister explanation quickly emerged. Cameroon's government is accused of spending between 2 to 6 times as much on infrastructure projects, and not just football-related projects, as comparable works of cost in other developing nations. The phrase that is often used in Cameroon is overbilling, or surfacturation in French, which is just a very nice way of saying corruption. It's a bit like all of the euphemisms that we have for corruption in the United Kingdom, as the press and opposition prefer to use words like sleaze, cronyism, and scandals. It seems as though there is a certain willingness, in a lot of countries, to be very quick to call out corruption in other countries, but to butter it up and sugarcoat it a little bit when it comes to very similar or even almost identical instances occurring at home. Economists in Cameroon, or exiled from Cameroon, essentially accuse the government and Cameroon's president of paying 1.8 billion euros of the nation's wealth for only 300 million euros worth of infrastructure and development projects, suggesting that the rest had been siphoned off through dodgy contracts handed to firms who have close ties to government officials. It was very evident that Cameroon would not be able to host the 2019 African Cup of Nations, even without the increased violence caused by the Anglophone crisis in the country's northwest region and an insurgency movement led by Boko Haram. So, Morocco were touted as the replacement host instead. Except, Morocco then told CAF that they weren't interested, so Egypt ended up hosting the tournament instead of them. It is worth pointing out that Cameroon is not the first country to be stripped of African Cup of Nations hosting rights following a successful bid. Far from it, in fact. The 1998 Afcon was originally scheduled to be hosted by Zambia, who pulled out in 1986 due to financial issues, with Algeria asked to replace them. Algeria accepted that invitation, but then became involved in a dispute with CAF, who stripped them of their replacement hosting rights and gave the tournament to Morocco instead. Algeria were awarded the 1990 African Cup of Nations instead, where they won the tournament for the first time. The 1994 African Cup of Nations was awarded to Zaire, but political upheaval as Mobutu's reign began to unravel put pay to that as Tunisia stepped in as their replacement. Kenya was supposed to host the 1996 Afcon before President Moi told CAF that they had changed their mind, fearing that the planned stadium construction and hosting of the tournament in opposition strongholds could strengthen his political opponent's hands. So, South Africa hosted that tournament instead. Then came Afcon 2000, which sounds like a brilliant old arcade game, but was actually just the first African Cup of Nations this millennium, which was due to be hosted by Zimbabwe, who was stripped of their hosting rights due to non-compliance with regulations, as Ghana and Nigeria stepped in as joint hosts to save the day. The 2015 Afcon was awarded to Morocco, who later demanded that the tournament be postponed due to the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, but CAF said no, banned them from the next 2 Afcon tournaments, fined them $1 million, demanded a further $9 million in compensation, and handed their hosting rights over to Equatorial Guinea on Africa's west coast. Morocco had the fines and future bans overturned by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, but they were still expelled from the tournament in Equatorial Guinea. And in 2017, Libya had been scheduled to host the tournament but had their hosting rights rescinded by CAF due to the ongoing Second Libyan Civil War, and Gabon was selected as host instead. So, a change of Afcon hosts really is nothing new and nothing unusual. In fact, it is almost a surprise if the country, which enjoys a successful bid to host the African Cup of Nations, actually ends up hosting the tournament at all. You would be better off saving cash, avoiding the famously costly bidding process, and just stepping in and saying, yeah, alright, we'll do it, when the scheduled host inevitably pulls out or has their host status removed. What's more, if your country is selected as future Afcon hosts, that tends to be a pretty bad omen that the nation is on the verge of a coup, civil war, proxy war, external invasion, or some other such upheaval. The removal of Cameroon's 2019 hosting rights did come as a particular blow to the country though. Football is huge in Cameroon, and it has been since the 1920s. Cameroon have only once hosted the African Cup of Nations, almost 50 years ago, despite being one of Africa's strongest nations when it comes to football, having qualified for more World Cup finals than any other African national team, and having won the African Cup of Nations 5 times, which is the second most of any national team behind Egypt. Egypt, by comparison, have hosted Afcon 5 times. And even Gabon, a tiny nation of 2 million people, whose entire footballing pedigree consists solely of Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang and Daniel Kouzan, have hosted the tournament twice. So football is very important in Cameroon, and the removal of the country's first Afcon in almost 5 decades because they failed to sort out their stadiums and roads with 5 years' notice was viewed as both a domestic and international humiliation, something which came as pretty bad news to Cameroon's president, Paul Biya. Biya is a man who understands the importance of football all too well, and he has often weaponized it effectively over the years to gain political capital, making his blunder in 2019 even more of an own goal, if you will forgive me for the almost unavoidable pun. When I say over the years there, I mean over many, many years. Biya is the second longest serving head of state in Africa and the longest ruling non-royal leader anywhere in the world, having assumed office in 1982 during the same year that Cameroon made the first of their 7 appearances at the finals of a FIFA World Cup. Biya is 88 years old now, soon to turn 89, as he approaches his 6th decade in office and his 4th decade as president of Cameroon. Now, I hope you won't think that I'm being ageist when I say that 88 is too old to be president and 40 years is too long for anyone to rule a nation. But even if you would challenge that assertion, I hope that it would be on the grounds that perhaps one could make an exception, assuming that the 88-year-old in question was still right at the top of their game, the best man or woman for the job, and still enjoyed the popular support of his fellow countrymen and women. However, there is good reason to believe that none of that is true of Biya, who has become almost the archetypal corrupt dictator over the decades, if not an outright tyrant. I just said that Biya is the world's longest ruling non-royal leader, and whilst that is factually correct, the 88-year-old is certainly Cameroon's king in his own head. Biya served as Cameroon's Prime Minister from 1975 to 1982, replacing Cameroon's first president, Ahmadou Ahidjo, when he resigned. That means that in more than 60 years since Cameroon gained independence from France, the country has only been led by 2 people, and only one party, which doesn't exactly reek of democratic freedom. Ahidjo turned Cameroon into a single-party state during his presidency, outlawing all parties, other than his own, which was then known as the Cameroonian National Union, but is now rather ironically called the Cameroon People's Democratic Movement. In spite of his predecessor's hard work to remove any semblance of opposition, Biya rapidly set about making Cameroon somehow even less democratic during the early years of his premiership. There had been surprise initially in Cameroon that Ahidjo, a Muslim from the north of Cameroon, had stepped down for Biya, a Christian from the south, and it didn't take long for him to regret that decision. Ahidjo went into exile in France following a brutal feud between the two in 1983, where he was sentenced to death in absentia for his alleged involvement in a plot to coup Cameroon's new president. Biya, used the two failed attempts to overthrow him in 1983 and 1984 in order to consolidate power and justify increasingly authoritarian measures. Cameroon consistently ranks among the least free and most corrupt nations on earth, tied in terms of domestic freedoms with the Islamic Republic of Iran according to the Freedom in the World Index, and also tied with Iran in terms of corruption and also Tajikistan. Biya is responsible for some of the most authoritarian crackdowns on journalists that you will find anywhere in the world, and the death of newspaper editor Germain Cyril Ngota in police custody in 2010, along with the torture and intimidation of 13 other journalists, made international news, with allegations of arbitrary and unlawful extrajudicial killings and torture having been rife. Biya even switched off the internet for over a month in northwest and southwest Cameroon in 2017. There's also the fact that Cameroon is now believed to prosecute consensual same-sex conduct more aggressively than any other nation on earth, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. In light of Russia being awarded the 2018 World Cup, Qatar the 2022 World Cup, meanwhile Azerbaijan seem to be the darlings of UEFA right now, having been awarded both the 2019 Europa League final and 4 games at Euro 2020, it is yet more evidence of football governance' absolute disdain, or at the very least total disregard, for the LGBT community, whether that be FIFA, UEFA or CAF. I'm not saying that viciously demonizing and criminalizing LGBT people is a prerequisite for hosting a major international football tournament these days, but it certainly doesn't hurt your chances. In the early 1990s, following some pressure exerted by the international community, Paul Biya, very reluctantly, accepted the quasi-re-implementation of multi-party politics. In the 1992 presidential elections following his rule change, Biya won the election with less than 40% of the vote, as his nearest rival finished just 4 points behind him. Had Cameroon's opposition parties and politicians united behind one candidate in 1992, Cameroon might look very different today. In subsequent elections, in 1997, 2004, 2011, and most recently 2018, Biya has won with huge margins, in elections widely considered to be rigged by both opposition parties at home and most of the international community. After almost being unseated in 1992, Biya seemingly wasn't prepared to take that same risk at the ballot box again, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Biya actually lost the 1992 election, and all subsequent elections have been almost entirely fraudulent. In 2008, there were incidents of civil unrest in Cameroon after Biya's party voted to remove term limits, thus allowing him to become president for life, unless he is somehow deposed. When Biya isn't brutally suppressing journalists or rigging elections, he likes to spend vast amounts of public resources on holidays in Europe or the United States, sometimes spending as long as 3 months in a single destination, claiming that allows him to, quote, work without being disturbed. The de facto dictator's favourite holiday destination is believed to be the Hotel Intercontinental in Geneva, Switzerland. Some of his trips have allegedly cost as much as $40,000 a night, and his total holiday travels were estimated to have cost Cameroon some $120 million by Radio France Internationale in 2018. It would be fair to say that there are cheaper and less luxurious ways to work without being disturbed, like putting earplugs in, for example, which is what I do, though I would imagine Biya's methods result in him having a much better time than me sat in the kitchen with earplugs in, typing away whilst munching on Weetabix minis. That isn't product placement, by the way. Plenty of other sources of iron and vitamin D are available. I am somewhat making light of Biya's disdain for his fellow countrymen and women here, but there is a very real human cost to his misrule. Cameroon is a country with vast natural resources and a large working-age population. The country should be rich, but instead, 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. The nation's infrastructure is a joke, and a life expectancy of less than 60 means that Cameroonians, on average, die 12 years earlier than the worldwide average. There's nothing funny about that. Much of Cameroon's wealth is extracted by the country's former colonial rulers France through French nationals and French companies and subsidiaries, and in turn, France prop up Biya's corrupt regime and support him against any impending opposition. That opposition can currently be most fervently felt in northwest and southwest Cameroon in what is another colonial legacy. As you can see on this map, which shows the various regions of modern-day Cameroon, the territories coloured in blue represent the part of the country that was ruled by France, whilst the northwest and southwest regions coloured in red represent what was once known as British Southern Cameroons. For a more complete history, these are the boundary changes of Cameroon over the years, the orange representing when the German Empire controlled Cameroon. To this day, people in the red part of Cameroon, which constitutes most of the country, predominantly speak French, and the people in the minority blue section predominantly speak English. Language is important, and it has created a distinct Anglophone community in northwest and southwest Cameroon who consider Cameroon to be irredeemably corrupt and Biya to be a despot who is in the hands of a French elite which siphons off much of the nation's wealth and kills with impunity. In many respects, it is difficult to argue with them. So they want out, and in 2017, following a period of guerrilla warfare against Cameroonian security forces, Ambazonian leaders in the region declared independence. President Biya responded by declaring war on the separatists and sent in the army for a war which is still ongoing and turning what was once known as the Anglophone crisis into a full-blown Cameroonian civil war. Concerned about the uprising, France and President Macron have offered Cameroon their support, but in doing so, they have only strengthened the case of the separatists who claim France's involvement in the conflict is further evidence of their imperial presence in Cameroon. This presents a political problem for Biya, one which seems unlikely to subside anytime soon and is quite likely to get much, much worse, despite thousands having already been killed and the best part of 1 million people displaced. But it also presents a problem in terms of Cameroon hosting next week's African Cup of Nations. One of Cameroon's 6 venues for the tournament, the Limbe Stadium in Limbe, is in the country's Anglophone zone. Meanwhile, the Koué-Kong Stadium in Bafoussam is just outside of the conflict-ridden region. Numerous people have expressed concern about a heightened threat of violence around those games, and an enlarged national security presence may only actually fan the flames of separatist violence and fervour. All of this means that something which has typically been a rare unifying force in Cameroon, football, no longer seems capable of bringing people together, and a large cloud lingers over this twice-postponed tournament. Some people are still excited. The Afcon is coming to Cameroon for the first time in 50 years. The hosts will be hoping to cause an upset, and they are coming into this tournament off the back of 4 wins on the bounce. Others are filled with rage and despair. Economists view Cameroon's Afcon expense as not just being a reckless but actually a criminal waste of national resources, estimating that Biya's regime has spent 6 times as much as was required on the construction of stadiums and infrastructure projects for a tournament that will recoup nowhere near that amount, even if it were a huge success. To them, the 2021 Afcon is nothing more than a way for Biya to enrich himself, his allies, and those around him, whilst looking to recover his reputation at home by exploiting the people of Cameroon's passion for football and their national pride surrounding the national team. That passion for football has also been to Biya's detriment though. After Cameroon was stripped of the 2019 Afcon, a lot of people became engaged with the ideas of overbilling and corruption, and Biya's opponents, many of them now exiled from Cameroon, were able to turn that into a conversation that went beyond football alone, and into the realm of corruption in Cameroon more broadly. As if corruption, rampant human rights abuses, and ludicrously overbuilt infrastructure wasn't enough, the 2021 Afcon will now also have to contend with not just the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but also the emergence of a seemingly far more infectious Omicron variant. President Biya is accused of downplaying the threat posed by COVID-19 to Cameroon, particularly in light of the African Cup of Nations, and of implementing a lack of health and safety precautions, or, in truth, any health or safety precautions. Calls for the tournament to be postponed due to the threat of Omicron have been largely dismissed and derided by Biya and officials in Cameroon, though both this variant and this Afcon are extremely fast-moving situations, opening up the possibility of that having changed by the time this video actually comes out. According to official statistics, there have been 108,000 recorded COVID cases in the country, 1,841 of which have been attributed to people's deaths. Both figures seem extremely low, the latter of which could be partly justified by Cameroon having one of the world's youngest populations and therefore being less likely to suffer fatalities as a result of the virus than older and more vulnerable populations, but the more likely explanation for both is the fact that Cameroon carries out very few COVID tests and fewer than 1 in 10 deaths in the country, from any cause, are ever documented or reported, meaning that we cannot even look to excess death statistics to get a better idea of how COVID might really have impacted Cameroon. The result is a fair amount of COVID skepticism in Cameroon, according to a number of reports, with some people considering COVID not to be a problem in Cameroon and even a virus that only affects white people. Of course, there is absolutely no evidence that this is the case. And to make matters worse, just 3% of Cameroon's population has received even a single COVID-19 vaccination. So that is why, for those of you who didn't already know, there is so much controversy and scandal surrounding the 2021 African Cup of Nations, which is actually taking place in 2022, and why a lot of people have called, or at least were calling at one stage, for the tournament not to take place at all. Paul Biya will be 92 years old at the time of Cameroon's next election. He has already stated his intention to run again. If he wins that election, and he will make sure that he does, he will be handed the keys to Cameroon's Palace of Unity, as it is again rather ironically named, until the age of 99, assuming that he lives that long. A reminder at this point that the average life expectancy in Cameroon is under 60. But then again, most people in Cameroon don't live in a house that looks like this, they don't all take 3-month-long $40,000 a night vacations, and they aren't all estimated to be worth $200 million, which is a heck of a net worth, even for someone on a pretty hefty $620,000 a year salary. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, I hope you did. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.